Is everyone feeling stretched out and warrior-like? That ends that way. I'm going to ask this question again. Are we feeling stretched out and warrior-like? All right, much better, much better. I like that. Up next, Dr. Jonathan Rosenthal is a board-certified neurologist in New York City. He completed his Bachelor of Science degree in neuroscience at NYU, his Doctor of Medicine at NYU School of Medicine, his residency in neurology, and position as chief resident at NYU Hospital, Bellevue Hospital, and the Manhattan VA, and is currently completing a fellowship in clinical neurophysiology at Weill Cornell School of Medicine and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. His work on TBI was recognized by the American Academy of Neurology Young Investigator Award. He is an avid yoga student of Sri Dharma Mitra. He is passionate about understanding yoga interventions in medicine and hosts the Neuroscience and Yoga Online Conference annually during Brain Awareness Week to help people everywhere understand and apply the current science of how yoga affects the brain. Please welcome Dr. Rosenthal, who is joining us virtually from New York and speaking about research on yoga interventions for MS. Welcome, Dr. Rosenthal.
Hello, everyone there in Illinois. Are you able to hear me well? Maybe, I don't know, someone just show me a thumbs up if you can hear me well. Okay, I see some thumbs up from people online, so I think that means it's staying. Is everyone able to see my slides? Actually, I can see my slides on your screen, so I think we're good. All right, if there are any issues, please let me know as we go. But thank you for that kind introduction. It is so nice to be here presenting. And thank you to Mindy and the whole Yoga Moves MS team. You guys are amazing. You're doing awesome work, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I hope you'll get a lot of scientific insight and inspiration and practical tips out of this presentation. And as was mentioned, I'm presenting live from New York. And I just have to say, the reason I'm so excited about this and the reason I'm so passionate about understanding how yoga affects the brain is we live in a time when science misinformation runs rampant, especially on the internet. And so my mission here is to really share high quality scientific data and reasoning so that you can sift through some of that noise and truly understand what the scientific literature is saying about yoga. And so the title of this talk is Yoga and Multiple Sclerosis. And it's just important to say this. I have no financial disclosures. I don't own any stock in yoga companies. I do sell some educational material related to neuroscience and yoga, but of course that's optional and not required for you to attend this lecture. Okay. So an overview of what we're going to go over so you can have your expectations well calibrated. So we'll go over quickly what really is yoga, what are the core components of yoga, and how does that change when we talk about yoga in scientific research. And then we'll dive into some specific components of the MS population. So symptoms and things that people with MS deal with, and how yoga has been studied for them. And then finally, we'll end with some limitations and practical takeaways and where to learn more. And I hope to leave time for questions, so I'm going to be as efficient as possible. But yeah, as you're going through, as you're listening to this presentation, please jot down your questions. Okay, so let's start with an introduction to yoga. So when you think of yoga, what comes to mind? I think you just had a yoga session before this, but just think in your head, what does yoga look like to you? Well, when I Google this, this is what I get. And this is really just fit young people in tight pants. This is not really what yoga is. And so, just to be very clear about what yoga is, it is an ancient practice that was initially designed to bring health, mental sharpness, and ultimately a settled mind so that the practitioner could shift their identification from the body and mind to something called the higher self, which is like the nectar of consciousness. And yoga came about in parallel to Hinduism and Buddhism, but yoga itself is a secular practice, and the goal is self-realization. And fitting with that, there are 8 components of yoga, and these are those 8 main parts as first described by Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, probably written in the 400 CE or AD. And so those 8 components are ethical rules, so how you treat other people, and those include compassion and truthfulness, non-stealing, and then also how you treat yourself. So these are the personal observances, which include discipline and cleanliness and contentment and devotion and an element of surrender in everything you do. And people are very surprised to learn this about yoga, right? People really associate yoga primarily with the postures, maybe the breath control, and also meditation, right? But leading up to meditation, there is withdrawal from the senses, which is kind of directing your attention inwards, sustaining your attention, so concentrating on something, and then even sustaining that for a long time, which is when it becomes meditation. And that's ultimately how someone achieves that state of union. Okay, so just to emphasize, yoga really doesn't look like those pictures. And looking at these practices, you can really see that yoga is supposed to be for everybody. And there are ways to adapt yoga to everyone. There's chair yoga for people who may have mobility limitations. There's yoga that's just singing. This is called bhakti yoga. There's also yoga that's going around doing good deeds for people. This is called karma yoga. And so there's really meant to be a type of yoga available to everyone in every age group and with every disease type. In the scientific literature, this changes a little bit. It's not all of those components that get represented in the interventions. So usually in the scientific literature, yoga is defined by postures, breathing, relaxation, and meditation. And this is changing to some extent where some of those philosophical elements are included. But this is important to state because now we know any of the results I'm going to go over included these 4. And so these 4, when put together, lead to the effects we're going to go over. And with regards to the MS population, it's actually really, really important to talk about this also because for the longest time, like maybe up until the 1980s and 1990s, it was actually recommended for patients with multiple sclerosis to rest, to not participate in exercise. And this is because of kind of a misapplication of this phenomenon called Uthoff's phenomenon. Is everyone familiar with Uthoff's phenomenon? I can't really hear you, so I won't get the feedback to know. But so Uthoff's phenomenon is when heat exacerbates MS symptoms. So sometimes patients with MS will go out into a hot summer day and really feel their fatigue, their pain, their spasticity worsen in that setting. It could even be a hot shower, but usually it's heat that triggers this. And so the thought was exercise makes you heat up, so it might trigger Uthoff's phenomenon, and so we should not recommend exercise for patients with MS. And of course, like hot yoga or heated exercises could really do that. But the research has really, really changed to the point now that tolerable exercise is universally recommended for patients with MS. And then the last thing to note about yoga in the scientific literature is that these practices have been found to be safe with minimal risk of harm. So the last thing you want to do is recommend yoga to someone and actually worsen, maybe even trigger an exacerbation of multiple sclerosis. But that has never been reported. I have seen some case reports of people getting severely injured. So these are usually like the New York Times had something about this, but obviously that wasn't in the scientific literature. But there are some case reports in the scientific literature of people doing very extreme postures without really, uh, guidance from a teacher, and then getting fractures of bones or tearing of blood vessels, right? And so those are really severe adverse outcomes. But when yoga is studied in randomized controlled trials taught by a well-credentialed teacher, I've never seen a severe adverse outcome. I've seen minor things like soreness and temporary joint pain come up, but I've never seen a severe injury. Okay, so with that, I think we're ready to dive into yoga and multiple sclerosis. We know what yoga looks like in the scientific literature. We know that yoga is safe, and we know that there's burgeoning research on exercise in multiple sclerosis. So let's talk about yoga. So customizing yoga for patients with multiple sclerosis is really important. About 60 to 80% of patients with MS have limited mobility. There may be trouble walking, and there may be chronic pain, and then many also have mental health symptoms, so depression, anxiety. So that's anywhere between 20 and 60%, depending on which study you look at. And if you ask patients with multiple sclerosis, 60% of them are using complementary and alternative medicine techniques like yoga to help with symptoms. And many of them are very convinced of its effects. And so we really owe it to our patients to understand what yoga is actually doing. So this is just taken, this is like a screenshot from PubMed, which is one of the main databases on scientific literature. And you can see from 1994 to 2024, and there were no studies before 1994, there are 112 total studies published on yoga and multiple sclerosis. In 2023, there were 11 studies added to this. And I have to say, most of them are really low quality. And so it seems like 112 studies might be a lot, but there's not much meaningful information to be gleaned from that. And I actually won't even report most of these 112 studies because I don't have confidence in their results. This is compared to yoga literature in general. And so you can see that yoga literature is way more developed than just the literature on multiple sclerosis and yoga. In 2023, there were 853 studies published on yoga. And the total, this is showing 8,300. Another database shows it's 15,000. So there's a ton of literature out there in the scientific repertoire about yoga. And same problem, there are many studies that are low quality, but when you have this high a number, there are going to be some good ones, right? So just to contextualize these two pictures, multiple sclerosis represents less than 1% of the total literature on yoga. And so to really apply yoga to the multiple sclerosis population, we have to extrapolate a bit. I can't give you studies for everything that will always be for multiple sclerosis patients. So we're going to be kind of pulling from some of this bigger yoga literature. Okay. And of course, there are some downsides to that, which we'll talk about. So now we can go over some specific topics. So the first one is one that I'm sure everyone is very, it's all over the news, it's all over the place all the time, mental health and stress. And it's an exploding topic. Just last year, in 2023, there were 218 scientific studies published on yoga and stress and mental health. And this brings the total to over 1,900. And it makes sense. Stress is really prevalent in our lives, and it makes the cover of leading magazines because of this. So I just have to ask you, how do you define stress? So when you hear stress, what do you think of? And I would love to hear what everyone is thinking, but I don't think it'll work, and I don't think we have time for it anyway. But just take another 10 seconds, think, what does stress mean to you? Okay, well, according to the scientific literature, and I think this is really going to change your view on stress, stress is about deploying resources. And it is a brain-determined process that affects the whole body with the goal of adaptation. And so this picture is a summary of how the stress system works. And you'll notice the whole goal is adaptation. And this is from one of my favorite review papers on stress physiology. So at the top, we have stressors, which are kind of the triggers that activate the stress system. And physical stressors can include things like infections, injuries, or hunger. And psychological stressors can include things like deadlines, financial strain, or grief. And both of them are kind of calculated in the brain to determine how many resources should I deploy for this. And then that is communicated to the body through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis or the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis. And this one is really a hormonal system. This one ends in cortisol. And this one is really a nervous system, like it operates through nerves. And so this one is very, very fast. And then from there, it targets every organ in the body. and also feeds back into the brain. And so in the body, it can change things like energy metabolism, the immune system, digestion, reproduction. In the brain, it can affect things like changing what proteins are expressed, how they are put in membranes, how new parts of cells are built, even the immune system of the brain. And all of this ultimately affects how neurons fire and how they are plastic, so how they are able to change. And again, all of that feeds into ultimately adaptation, so adjusting to that stressor and surviving. And so when we're thinking about stress, we really want to measure every part of this. And that's why I'm showing you this so that you see like, okay, these are the kind of like check boxes we need to go off as we're thinking about how yoga might affect stress. And stress really does matter. It has enormous impacts on our health. The literature on that is, unequivocal, and I think we all experience that. But at the same time, stress can also be really, really good. I mean, you hear in the common parlance like good stress and bad stress. Well, good stress is the stress that results in adaptation, and bad stress is the one that actually is maladaptive and ultimately impairs function. And at its worst, it can result in psychiatric diseases like anxiety and depression, most commonly, but also medical diseases like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, heart disease, and strokes. And for patients with multiple sclerosis, they often describe that stress is a trigger for not necessarily a flare of MS, like a new immune attack, but just like an exacerbation of symptoms. So, when we look closer at the brain, thinking about how the brain is deciding what is stressful and what is not, this is the network that really seems to be responsible for that. And I just want to make sure everyone is taking notes because there's a quiz on this at the end. I'm just kidding. There's no quiz. But the point of this complicated slide is just to impress on you that each line of this diagram is someone's whole PhD. Like they could dedicate their whole career to just understanding one of these lines. So this is decades of work put together trying to understand how the brain determines what is stressful. And what we know about yoga, and I'll show you some of these data, is that it seems to be really working in how parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, communicate with other parts of the brain, like the amygdala, to determine what is stressful. And in other words, it's like goal-oriented reasoning is able to dampen down the stress response. Of course, other interventions do this too, like psychotherapy and cognitive behavioral therapy and so many more. And it's important to compare yoga to those to really know how effective yoga is, and you'll see some of those studies. But one thing to note is yoga is a lot cheaper than therapy. Okay, so this is the first study we're going to look at. And this is a meta-analysis, which is the highest level of evidence in science. And what it does is it mathematically combines many other studies to come to one conclusion. Now, when you're doing this, you have to choose the studies carefully. You have to choose good studies because if you choose bad studies, we just say it's garbage in, garbage out. So this meta-analysis, they were very careful to include only high-quality studies that compared yoga to an active control. So comparing yoga to something like health education, stretching, psychotherapy, or aerobic exercise. And they looked at many of the measures of stress from the diagram we were looking at before. So cortisol, blood pressure, heart rate variability, fasting blood glucose, cholesterol, low density lipoprotein. And they ultimately included 42 studies in their analysis. And so what did they find? Well, I'm just presenting a summary. So the whole paper looks like this, and I didn't want to overwhelm your eyes with too many of these charts, but there were significant effects found on perceived stress score, which is kind of like a subjective measure of stress. So really suggesting that at the brain level, there were changes. Waking cortisol, so that was that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis system. Interleukin-6, which is a measure of inflammation and kind of the immune system in the body. Mean arterial pressure, so a measure of blood pressure. Fasting blood glucose, a measure of metabolism, along with LDL, low density lipoprotein, and triglycerides. And so all of these together really support that this whole stress system is affected by yoga. And even more important to note about this meta-analysis is that they included a broad range of population. So they didn't have a study dedicated to MS in the sample, but in addition to healthy people, they also had people with depression, people with anxiety, people with cancer, people with GI illnesses, people with heart disease, and so many more, which really suggests that these observed effects are not specific to a particular population and that they really are generalizable. Also, these effects are greater than the active controls. So most commonly that was exercise, therapy, or health education. And so yoga seems to be more effective than those. So yeah, really powerful study. And we were talking a little bit about how yoga probably works by affecting brain networks. Well, this is one of the best systematic reviews of all the literature on neuroimaging in yoga. And I'm going to summarize this slide quickly. There's a lot going on here, but it really is supporting what we were talking about before. So they measure not only structural changes in the brain, but also functional changes. So in other words, they looked at not only the size of different brain regions, but also how much blood flow they were getting or how much glucose they were taking up with different imaging techniques, and really showed that yoga increased activity in those frontal parts of the brain, which then resulted in them even growing in some instances, and then suppressed activity in some of those stress networks like the amygdala. And again, in certain instances, the amygdala was smaller. And so this really supports this model of yoga working on these networks in the brain and then all of stress physiology following. And if we apply this to mental health, this is from a review paper really from a while ago, and there are even more studies now, but this systematic review and meta-analysis is pretty powerful, showing that for depression, yoga compared to usual care, so psychotherapy and medication, yoga was more effective. Yoga versus relaxation, yoga was more effective. Yoga versus aerobic exercise, yoga was more effective. And for anxiety, yoga versus usual care, yoga was just as effective, and yoga versus relaxation, yoga was more effective. And so really powerful findings that all suggest that across a broad range of populations, yoga affects the stress physiology, and this can have benefits for mental health. Okay, but those were all studies that had people doing yoga a few times a week for 6 to 24 weeks. So what they do in this review paper is they're looking at only a single practice. So doing yoga once for 30 to 60 minutes, and they show that yoga actually reduces stress reactivity, meaning that yoga was protective against future stressors, just a single session. And the last thing I want to show you from this stress and mental health work is, does it matter if you like yoga? And what they did in this study is they had people in two groups, either the ones who got to choose whether they did yoga or not, and the ones who were forced to. And what they showed is that it didn't matter. Whether you were forced to do yoga or you chose to do yoga, the outcomes were the same. So it doesn't really seem to matter if people like it. Okay, so just a reminder, please jot down your questions. We'll move on to yoga and fatigue, and I promise the next few sections are a bit faster. So this is really one of the only things we have on yoga and fatigue right now. And fatigue is a really common symptom in multiple sclerosis. Um, and for this review paper from Holger Kramer, they are comparing yoga versus usual care, which is, usual care was just continue what you're doing in the studies, don't change anything, and comparing it to aerobic exercise. And you see that yoga was better than not really doing anything else, but it was just as effective as aerobic exercise. Okay, and now yoga and pain. So the published research in the MS population is so weak that I'm actually not willing to present any of the studies. There are other studies published on yoga and pain, and there are pretty significant effects on low back pain, neck pain, migraine. But these are so different than the central neuropathic pain like trigeminal neuralgia and others that come with multiple sclerosis that I really don't think it's generalizable. So we don't have good evidence right now on yoga for pain. Though, of course, you could extrapolate and say, if yoga improves stress and improves sleep and other features in multiple sclerosis, it might improve pain. Those are all speculative. Okay, so now cognition. So this is where we can talk about some really interesting things. And I'm going to present mostly on the population in general rather than a multiple sclerosis specific population, but these are likely generalizable. So we'll start with working memory. And working memory is really what you experience when you're trying to remember a phone number or keep something in mind, for a short time. And one way to measure this is this test called the NBAC. And so this study from Dr. Neha Goethe was using the NBAC and comparing yoga to aerobic exercise. And what they found was that as the NBAC got more difficult, so 1 is more difficult than 0, 2 is more difficult than 1, yoga really stood out. And compared to aerobic exercise and their baseline, people who were in the yoga group had faster reaction times and higher accuracy on this test, the NBAC. And they later did a follow-up study showing that this was related to stress. So people who had more stress reduction, so improvements in stress, had more improvements in these cognitive tasks. And this is really important for the MS population. So one of the main deficits in cognition and multiple sclerosis is actually processing speed because of the white matter damage that comes from the attacks. And so it kind of makes the argument like, oh, it's improving reaction time. Could that be helpful for processing speed in multiple sclerosis? Of course, we need more research to say that part for sure. And the NBAC really relies on the prefrontal cortex. So all working memory relies on the prefrontal cortex, and that comes from this study from 1971 that I won't spend too much time on. And what this really tells us is, again, that yoga is really working on these prefrontal cortical networks if it's helping the NBAC. And we talked about the NBAC, but there are many other measures of what we call fluid intelligence, of which working memory is a part. And just in an aging population, working memory tends to decline. So you can see as people age, this is just normal, healthy controls. Their fluid intelligence declines with age. And in this study, they looked at yogis, which is this top line, and meditators, and basically showed that their fluid intelligence declined less, such that people in their 60s who were yogis and meditators looked more like people who were in their 40s who were not practicing yoga or meditating. They also did another analysis in the same paper where they built a model of the brain, and I'm not going to get into this too much, and they just sampled what would happen if you damaged one part at a time. And the yogi and the meditator brains held up to that damage better. And so they were suggesting that, according to this model, brain resilience was improved by these practices. And you could see how this would apply to a multiple sclerosis population. So if there's damage to particular regions with attacks, with multiple sclerosis attacks, having this brain resilience would be really helpful. In terms of long-term memory, so long-term memory occurs when this part of the brain, the hippocampus, recognizes the co-occurrence of many different features across the rest of the brain and then connects them. So it might say, oh, if this person is in this location at this time, it means that they want a donut. I don't know why I came up with that example, but this whole process of encoding, so recognizing that connection and then retrieving and ultimately consolidating it. Consolidating means you actually store it among connections in the brain independently of the hippocampus. All of this depends on being able to pay attention to the things you're trying to remember, and then consolidation really depends on getting good sleep. And the study that I'm showing here is from people I know personally, Julia Basso and Alexandra McHale, and they did this study where they randomized people to either listen to a podcast or do a meditation every day. And the people in the meditation group had significantly improved memory scores compared to the control. And if we look at this on a molecular level, there's this signaling molecule, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is responsible for many of the neuroplasticity changes that happen in the brain. And if we look at this molecule in people who practice yoga, so this was a very intense yoga study. They had people practicing 6 days a week. I think it was, I forget how many months, 3 or 6 months. It was a very long time. It was 3 months. I have it written down. And so what they showed here is that brain-derived neurotrophic factor was much higher after doing the yoga intervention, such that the people in their 40s and 50s looked like people in their 20s. Again, kind of like that 20-year improvement that we saw before with the fluid intelligence. And this also manifests anatomically, so similar to that neuroimaging paper we looked at before. This was actually one of the studies included in that, and they showed that with yoga practice, the left hippocampus, which was much larger, again, suggesting that long-term memory could be improved. And if we look at this with regard specifically to the MS population, for cognition, there were really only 2 studies that were done, and there doesn't seem to be any difference between yoga and exercise because these lines overlap, though there may be a trend. You know, we need more studies to really get the definitive answer on this. In terms of quality of life, this is a huge mess, and I don't think we have great data on yoga improving quality of life for patients with MS, though, of course, anecdotally, many people report that. But this study is all over the place, and you can see how many different analyses they did. So anytime you have a study where they're doing the same analysis multiple times, comparing things, you just increase the chances of false positives when you do that. And so I'm a little bit skeptical of this one. The last one I'll show is yoga and neurogenic bladder. So neurogenic bladder, for anyone who's not familiar with it, is when damage to the nervous system causes dysfunction of the bladder. And this dysfunction is usually that the bladder cannot contract well enough to get urine out. And so people have urinary incontinence when it kind of overflows. And so what they showed here is they actually measured how much urine was in the bladder with an ultrasound, and they measure this thing called post-void residual, so how much urine is left after you urinate. And normally it should be very little, but with neurogenic bladder, it's much higher. And so you can see before they did the yoga intervention, there was a lot of urine left in the bladder, and then after the yoga intervention, there was less. This is a very weak study with a small sample size and no control group, but it's really all we have for this important topic. And for the sake of time, I'll skip this. So, okay, I just have to emphasize, you can see we need a lot more research on yoga for MS currently. So I hope you'll leave this talk with a passion for advocating for that. And of all the studies I presented, no one study is perfect. Many had small samples, many had not diverse enough samples, many of them are even biased. And this is really true in the MS literature, where so many of them don't even have a control group. And so it's really hard to study yoga in the MS population right now. I'm just going to get right to the point. So there are a few practical takeaways that I think we can take from what I've shown you. And so the main components of yoga in scientific studies include postures held for 30 to 90 seconds each, slow and controlled breathing, relaxation, and meditation, and they varied that from 6 to 24 weeks. In the general population, but not as well studied in MS specifically, there's mounting evidence that yoga positively affects stress physiology at every level, including the brain networks that determine stress, the outputs of stress, so cortisol in the autonomic nervous system, and the health results of stress, so blood pressure, inflammation, depression, and anxiety. And then there were even acute effects where a single class was sufficient to reduce stress reactivity. Whether a practitioner chose to do yoga or is assigned to does not make it less effective. There's growing evidence that yoga improves working memory, so those frontal lobe networks. There is also growing evidence that yoga improves long-term memory and biomarkers of long-term memory. And then yoga improves fatigue as much as aerobic exercise does. The data on quality of life are mixed with yoga, and there's weak early data on yoga for neurogenic bladder. Ooh, okay, I tried to give you as much a summary of the literature as I could in 25 minutes. Thank you for bearing with me. I hope I've given you a fair summary. I don't want you to think of yoga as a magic pill or a panacea. It definitely has quantifiable, demonstrable benefits, and it's making its way into the guidelines for many diseases like migraine and cancer. We still have a lot of work before before yoga is in the guidelines for MS. And I thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you listening and finding interest in this. Please reach out to me at any point if you have any questions. I think the organizers of the conference will have my contact information. And these are the first page of references and the second page of references. And I welcome any questions. Yeah, so I see one question online about what type of yoga was in some of the studies, and it's variable. So every single study had different yoga interventions. So different styles of yoga like Iyengar, Hatha Raja, Vinyasa, right? So there's all these different schools and style of yoga, and it almost doesn't matter. Whichever one people do, it seems to have the same effect. So, sometimes people are always asking, what's the one posture, what's the breathing exercise I need to do to improve my whatever it is? And, we just don't have those answers. And it seems like as long as you're doing yoga, so postures, breathing, relaxation, meditation, it seems to work.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Any questions for Dr. Rosenthal?
So Chantal is asking, what can we, the attendees of this webinar and in person, do to help the research on MS? And that's an excellent, excellent question. So I don't have a great answer, but I think we live in an age of brain
Repeat that
research.
question.
Yes, I can repeat it. What can we, the attendees of this webinar and in person, do to help the research on MS? And I don't have a great answer, but we live in a time where the funding is really determined by national organizations. And so it comes down to advocating for it at a national level. You can write for people and say you want more funding for studying complementary and alternative medicine in multiple sclerosis. There's a body of the NIH called the NCCIH. I always forget what it stands for, but it's like the National Complementary something something Institute of Health. And they can definitely help direct more funds. And we also need more researchers interested in it who are willing to do the work to actually conduct the research. So if you're willing to pursue more education and do that, I think that would be awesome.
Thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Rosenthal? Thank you so much. Thank you. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Have you here.
Sorry it was such a whirlwind. I know it was a lot. Thanks for bearing with me.